it was seen as something at the top, just the president repeating statements, public announcements after the other about the need to fight off al-Shabaab. A year later, that has become a reality. We have more actors, more institutions, and more people talking about the fight against al-Shabaab, and not only talking, but doing the actions. So anything that starts with a vision needs to be institutionalized and operationalized. We have seen how that vision has taken us to the outskirts of El-Bur, to 600 kilometers from the borders of Hirshabelle and the borders with Ethiopia, all the way to Mudug and Galgudud. We also have been given an overview of what's expected in the second phase. So I am glad today that stabilization has more actors on the table than just few institutions or maybe the top leadership talking about it. We have very diverse set of international partners and diverse government institutions that understand that the future of legitimacy of the government hinges on our ability to reach the citizens. Around 4 million Somalis have been living under al-Shabaab for the last 15 years. Some of them have never seen schooling. Forget about formal schooling, they don't even have Quranic institutions, which were basic occurrence in any Somali village. The Minister of Education understands that education is a vital aspect of stabilization. I mean, we don't want to debate about what connotations does stabilization have and how has it been interpreted in different parts of the world. But for us as a government, we see stabilization akin to the very idea of governance, reaching the citizens, providing them services, from security to local government, from justice to policing. I will get to how the federal government envisions these things at a top planning level and what is the role of the communities, the federal member states, and everybody. Allow me to mention that when the first steps of a stabilization strategy were initiated in Somalia, I think under the Ministry of Interior, among others, that was the strategy of 2013-14 at that phase. It had a very narrow focus, and it had a very limited scope in terms of space and even time. But the type of stabilization we're talking about today is drastically different from the stabilization that was envisioned in those days. It is about retaining and recovering the remaining parts of Somalia that have been under al-Shabaab. Galgudud, Mudug, Galmudug, Hirshabelle, Hiran, Shabelle, in totality, within a matter of months, the expectation is that the war against al-Shabaab would go beyond the rivers to the other side. And let me make this point very clear. We Somalis are very good at forgetting things instantaneously. The gains that have been made cannot be undermined or undervalued. To start a war all the way from Hiran, Shabelle, Galgudud, Mudug, hundreds of kilometers, as the SNA has just revealed, is a major undertaking, as the envoy has emphasized. Massive logistical, training, preparation, community engagement, dialogue, prevention of conflict. It is not a magical occurrence overnight that happened. It took a lot of serious efforts. And we recognize and commend the role of the local communities, local administrations, leaderships at various levels. What was not possible for the last 10 years has been possible in the last 10 months. So we must really contextualize the gains and commend every actor for playing the role, from the generation of a vision and idea to the implementation. As we sit, there are more than 50 fronts in Somalia, where young Somali men and women with support from international partners, are facing off Al-Shabaab. That was not a reality before. The battlefields were sometimes on the outskirts of Mogadishu. I travel around the African continent to represent the government and the president, and I hear from leaders across Africa and international partners at the national forums that they can see the change in Somalia from distance. So as others view this from distance, we that are in the midst of it must recognize the gains and commend ourselves in that front. That does not mean everything is rosy, as they would say. Maybe we're only 10% there in the grand scheme of achievements of a viable Somali state, but we're heading in the right direction and we made gains. Of course, those gains would have been unattainable without the support of our partners. Every one of you sitting here and many not here, you contribute in one way or the other, and we appreciate that. One of the massive problems has been lack of coordination, overlapping practices, tendencies on our side, on the Somali side. I have been less interactive with the international partners as the lead on these issues because the approach was to first fix our ways, recognize what is it that we need to do as a government. For instance, as we have spent many days and months thinking about what does stabilization mean, we came to the conclusion that stabilization should lead to the generation of the following ideas, programs, and practices. To begin with, the preoccupation of our government has been military. Let's recruit more military. Let's recover more space. Now, under our discussions on stabilization, we came to the conclusion that there needs to be more focus on policing, community policing, local governments, justice. You cannot expect the military to do everything. So when we talk about security, the first prerequisite is a national policing program that accommodates the needs of newly liberated areas. Without a police to replace the military so that they can go to the next battleground, you cannot talk about local government. And without local government, you cannot talk about meaningful social services. So under the leadership of the minister and members from the National Security Office, we have now come to realize the magnitude of the issue that awaits us. What is the total needs of policing in a district, somewhere in Mudug, or somewhere in around Kusimaha or Jama when we recover tomorrow? What is the cost of training them? What is the cost of arming them up? What is the cost of paying for them? So practitioners and experts and officials from the Ministry of Finance must factor in the huge monetary fiscal implications that the provision of security to another 4 million people involves. That is not something that an NGO can help us with. That is something that we as a government and federal member states must take into consideration and make it as part of our national programs. It is going to be in the hundreds of millions. Same for justice. Somebody can come and fetch us water, but nobody is going to build for us and pay for policing and judiciary services. These are the core functions of a government. When we form a local government in Elder or Haradere, what is the cost of running it? And how are they going to work with others? These are serious government issues, and we have been pondering on this and thinking about it for a while. So once we talk about security, rule of law, justice, and we talk about local government, interim administrations, conflict resolution. Lately, sometimes you may see occurrence here and there. These things were anticipated, and they are only natural. When you liberate new areas, it is natural that politics takes different shapes and forms. But it is a matter of, do you have the plans to rectify these things? The demand for, I was discussing with the minister, the demand for more participation in politics, the demand for more inclusion in the political process at every level of government is only increasing with time. Somalis are sick and tired of few people just representing them. So that is linked to the larger goal of democratization that comes under the Ministry of Interior. So we are recalibrating our approach to government as such. And stabilization serves as a tool to venture into that territory. Secondly, the Somali government, as I have come to utilize this analogy for a while now, is like fixing a vehicle in a workshop under the supervision of the mechanics and expecting that vehicle to also be on the road and running. And this time it's not a Formula One vehicle that has all the expertise that can instantaneously fix it. We are expected to build the institutions and also deliver. I really commend the Somali Armed Forces and SODMA, how they ensure the provision of basic foods and whatnot in those initial phases. I mean, the Americans often, in our discussions, tell us that it is important out of experience that when the military goes there, they're at least able to provide some basic things. It helps in establishing that bond and rapport with the communities. Finally, there are a set of things that need to happen on our side, and there are a set of things that need to happen on the side of our partners. On our side, competition and territorial approach to stabilization will not be tolerated or entertained. Every line ministry sitting here is responsible for a particular task. And I think the Somali public and the leadership of this country would hold the ministries accountable on how they perform in providing their services to the newly liberated areas. And our responsibility as a leadership is to ensure that resources are mobilized. That is where President Juarez, the envoy's observation that this is a heavy lifting and it needs a massive resource mobilization. So while we mobilize resources, we must know exactly what is being done with that. Policing, justice, health, education. If we cannot have a full-fledged hospital, maybe we can have a health post or a health center, and then there is a cost associated with it. As we enter into post-HEPIC and post-ATMOS world, we really must factor in the fiscal aspect of every action that we take. Gone are the days when we expect actors to even pay for our police. It's a new world that really puts a lot of responsibilities on our shoulders. So on our side, we're going to focus on a national strategic objectives for stabilization. Those strategic objectives are going to be thematic by nature and sectoral. It is expected that the Ministry of Justice does whatever it can under its budgetary constraints on the front of provision of conflict resolution and access to justice to these newly liberated areas. It is a very specific task, and it ought to happen, either in the shadow of a tree or maybe in one building somewhere in the district. You can debate about the cost of it, but it must happen. Similar with policing and with water and electricity. Minister Fiqh was telling me how so far in many of the liberated districts, the provision of lights through some of our agencies has been very positive. Once you have more light, more streets, more livelihood, it means coming back to normal life and the abundance of the ways of Al-Shabaab. In the coming days, I will be sitting with every line minister sitting here today, and I expect to see, as the leader of this interministerial committee, to see a clear strategy on what's happening in policing, what's happening in justice, what's happening in education, and what's happening in health. I understand there are other forums that deal with these more social issues. We want to link with them and integrate in a useful manner. There are fundings from the World Bank and others that focus on provision of national health basic services, water. How are those going to be connected? Of course, we will be accommodating the necessary requirements for every entity in terms of, is it a conflict scenario, is it an impartial context, and whatnot. Finally, on the side of our partners, these are the following things we would like to see. It is not anymore a project approach to stabilization. It is not only a programmatic approach. It is going to be a national strategic objectives to guarantee the military gains and to ensure that the efforts of our soldiers and our partners have not gone in vain. So stabilization is as important as the military front. One national policy, a coherent approach to these different sectors, no overlaps, and no preconceived projects that are more packaged for a particular context. Under the leadership of these line ministries, the Ministry of Interior and the Office of the Prime Minister, we would like to see progress in every subcomponent on this front. Some of these issues are more complex than others. For instance, the formation of local governments. They must be preceded by conflict resolution, social dialogue, interim administration, and actual ones. We understand the politics surrounding it. We understand the complexities around it. But if you don't establish these nascent institutions, we cannot free the military. And then they move on. That is what rule of law dictates. Sorry, I spoke for way too long. But we will be holding all our implementing partners accountable. The idea of just developing something that looks like a stabilization and saying that it's a stabilization will not be of interest to the Somali citizens. Finally, the federal member states. The federal member states, and this is an advice to all the line ministries sitting here, the federal member states is where things are going to happen. It is where the citizens are. You won't find a million citizens living in the Prime Minister's office or the Ministry of Interior. The citizens are in the federal member states. They are in destitute. They are in need. They have shown courage to be on the side of the government. We must work collaboratively, systematically with the federal line ministries. And as we have coordinated here at the federal level, we hope to see similar coordination mechanisms in the federal line ministries. And there is no room for monopolization of stabilization by one particular entity over the other. It is a complex, sectoral, interministerial policy area, and we'll approach it in that way. I really want to conclude by commending the reorganization that the donors and the partners are doing to their tasks. I have had very useful discussions with the UN. I have had useful discussions with the Europeans, Britain, Italy, Norway, and all our friends who are here, different actors, and how they have given stabilization a priority. How they are trying to mobilize resources. I mean, this is not something that was in the pipeline 4 years ago, 3 years ago, and it takes a while to mobilize resources. We commend your role, and we will have to run much faster than we're doing, so we count on you to run with us. Thank you very much.